Hello, my name is Olivia Genter, and today I will be talking about standardized testing and why we shouldn't use them. More specifically, why we shouldn't use them to assess an individual student's performance or future performance in the academic setting. The earliest known standardized test dates all the way back to the Han Dynasty. Standardized exams are administered and scored in a uniform manner, which means they are typically multiple choice and true-false questions, which make for easy and mass scoring. The content is often taught by teachers through mandatory curriculum. Now, there are two types of standardized tests. The first being aptitude, which can help predict how well someone will perform in the future academic setting. Examples of these types are the ACT and SAT, which I assume we have all experienced since they are used from colleges for admittance. The second type is achievement. These are exams evaluate a school's effectiveness in teaching the mandatory curriculum. Achievement exams can determine a school district's future funding and even earn them grants. They can also pinpoint weaknesses in the curriculum. Which leads me to some of the pros of standardized tests. Besides earning grants and pinpointing areas for improvement, they do also provide a good metric for learning, which leads to the allowance of comparison of students from different areas, like when colleges use ACT and SAT scores. But because of how these tests are designed, they tend to put people in boxes. Their results are supposed to predict answers like what career you will excel in, or how well you will do in your later education journey, or lack thereof. Because you are what you score, these tests determine if you get into college, if you are placed in advanced or need helper classes, what percentile you fall in with your peers, which for some people can affect how they see themselves. This is just one of the pressures placed on students. They also have to remember years' worth of content. Their performance affects the future and the future of their school district. These pressures can result in an effect on confidence before and after the exam. Students aren't the only ones who experience these exams pressures. Teachers also feel the weight by having to meet specific standards, which can lead to teaching for the test instead of for learning. The scores of the students ultimately fall on the teachers, which can then lead to a false measure of the teacher's performance. These tests are considered fair because everyone takes the same test, except we all don't succeed at the same things. Only math, reading, and science are tested, which ignores things like art and music. They also only assess how a student is at test taking, not who or how the student actually performs. A good example of how one standardized test doesn't work for the individual is how Whitewater Accounting used to do their tests for the first two accounting classes. There would be one test for multiple teachers teaching multiple classes, taken in one big lecture hall, where all the classes would come together on one day. Because not all teachers and classes move at the same pace, there would be a disconnect between what students knew and what was on the exams. Scores were low. So, Whitewater then moved to teachers creating their own tests and giving them in their own classrooms. And guess what? Scores improved. Since these tests determine school funding, things that aren't on the test don't get as much attention, which tends to lead to art departments being underfunded. And because so much is on these tests, students end up memorizing versus actually learning. These tests can't take into account the individual. They can't measure a student's creativity, social skills, or critical thinking. A student's learning style is also not taken into account. Because of how these tests are designed, a lot gets ignored and leads to no flexibility. Things like testing anxiety, where a student can't answer a question or take a test at full capacity because their mind won't allow it, or if a student has reading issues that causes them to read slow or rearrange a question. Even culture can be ignored and cause these tests to be unfair. Since so much importance is placed on these tests and what curriculum they contain, other areas are ignored, like my previous example of art classes. It has been studied that recent generations are lacking life skills that used to be commonly taught in schools in the past. One of the biggest concerns with these exams is that they can't always be reliable. They have to be designed specifically well with the right questions being asked and determine the right outcome. The results then also need to be interpreted correctly and the possibility of cheating minimized. There are alternatives to standardized testing. There is portfolio, which shows more of the student in different formats. Also performance, where a student has to demonstrate versus just answering a question. Lastly, sampling, which is still standardized testing, but with less impact on students and budgets. One interesting thing that has come out of the pandemic is that colleges are not always using ACT and SAT scores because students don't always have access to take these tests. This lends to the opportunity to see what it is like when more emphasis is put on a student's performance versus one test. In conclusion, yes, standardized tests have some advantages, but the issues are overshadowing them. This test continues to only measure the whole and not the individual, which is why I think they should not be used for assessing a student anymore.